In 1975, a 10-mile spit of sand on the ocean edge of Queens held 5% of the borough's population and 57% of its low-income housing. A generation earlier, the same strip of land had been where New York came to escape. In the summers before the war, as many as 1 million people crowded its 5-mile boardwalk on a single weekend. There was an amusement park with a wooden roller coaster that Hollywood put on film, block after block of cheap seaside bungalows, and a railroad that carried New Yorkers out of their crowded tenements and set them down at the sea. Then the crowd stopped coming, and the resort did not simply fade. The bungalows stayed, the land stayed, and a place built to be cheap, seasonal, and half-empty turned out to have almost no one left to speak for it. What happened on the Rockaway Peninsula was not an accident of decline. When the resort emptied, the city filled it, with the people the rest of New York had no room for. There are, in a sense, two Rockaways, and they sit on the same ground. The first is a barrier beach, a bar of sand roughly 10 miles long and, in most places, only a few blocks wide, curving off the southeastern corner of Queens into the open Atlantic. Its ocean side holds what is often called the largest urban beach in the United States, and for most of a century it pulled at working New York the way the tide pulls at water. Irish families came in such numbers that the peninsula earned a nickname it still carries, the Irish Riviera. Jewish families and every other group that made up the working city filled the boarding houses and the bungalow colonies behind the dunes. Above all, it was a democratic place. The price of admission was a train fare and a free afternoon. Whatever you were the rest of the year, on that sand you were one more body in the surf. The second Rockaway is what the same peninsula was made into. By the last quarter of the 20th century, the beach that had once taken in the whole city had been narrowed down to hold one part of it. Public housing rose in tight clusters toward the eastern end, in Edgemere, in Arverne, in Far Rockaway, while whole blocks in between were left vacant for decades. The result was a near-perfect contradiction. Some of the emptiest land in New York City lay directly beside some of its poorest households. And when the ocean came over the dunes in 2012, there were families on this peninsula who waited not days, but months for heat and power to come back. The distance between those two Rockaways is the subject here. That a beach resort would fade is no mystery. Hundreds of them did, all over the country, once cars and cheap airfare put the entire coastline within reach. What is specific to this place is how total the reversal was, and how much of it was chosen rather than simply suffered. The way a strip of land built to take in the entire city was remade, inside a single lifetime, into the place that city used to hold the people it had cleared out from everywhere else. Understanding that means starting where the value came from, with a narrow bar of sand that happened to sit just close enough to the largest city in America and just far enough away. Every story about the Rockaways has to begin with the shape of the land, because the shape of the land decided almost everything that followed. The peninsula is a barrier island, a bar of sand thrown up by the ocean and pinned along the southeastern rim of Queens. It runs about 10 miles from end to end and, for much of that length, measures only a few blocks across, with the open Atlantic on one side and the still water of Jamaica Bay on the other. A barrier island is a low and provisional kind of ground by nature. The highest points on the entire Rockaway Peninsula rise only about a meter above the sea. It is, in the most literal sense, a strip of beach that people decided to live on. For most of its history, the defining fact of that strip was not its beach, but its distance. The Rockaways sat close to the largest city in America and yet were cut off from it, reachable, before the age of engines, only by boat or by a long ride overland. That isolation set the terms. When the first resort appeared, it was a resort for people who could afford the trip. The beginnings were modest and early. A bathing house went up on the sand around 1816. By 1833, the site had grown into the Marine Pavilion, a large seaside hotel that drew wealthy New Yorkers out along the stagecoach roads to take the salt air. This was not yet a place of a million bodies on a boardwalk. It was an exclusive retreat, and it was exclusive precisely because it was hard to reach. Getting there cost time and time and money did the sorting. And that is the point the whole century turns on. The thing that made the Rockaways valuable in 1833. Separation, a world set apart from the crowded city, was the same quality that would one day make the peninsula useful for the opposite purpose. A place apart can be a luxury. It can also be a place to put what a city would rather keep out of sight. In 1833, it was the first of those. What changed everything was not the sand. It was a way to get there fast. The change came on rails. In 1868, a railroad reached the peninsula for the first time, and in 1873, the Long Island Railroad ran a line all the way out to the beach. Part of it carried across the open water of Jamaica Bay on a long timber trestle. What had been a half-day's journey by boat or coach was suddenly a trip of under an hour. That single hour broke the old arithmetic. The sorting that distance had always done, reserving the sand for those with time and money to spare, was finished. Anyone who could afford a ticket could now stand in the same surf that had once belonged to the guests of the Marine Pavilion. The effect was not gradual, it was a flood. By the 1876 season, the combined receipts of the resort establishments strung along the Rockaways had reportedly reached about $180,000, a staggering sum for a bar of sand that a generation earlier had supported little more than a single hotel. Where there had been one grand pavilion, there were now hotels by the dozen, bathhouses, saloons, and rows of rented rooms, every one of them fed by the timetable. New resort settlements took shape around the stations themselves, each stop letting the summer crowds off almost at the water's edge. That was the unlock, and it is worth being exact about what it changed. The railroad did not simply bring more people to the same resort. It converted the peninsula from one kind of place into another, from a retreat that ran on exclusivity into a machine that ran on volume. From then on, the whole arrangement rested on a single thread. The town depended on the crowd, and the crowd depended on the train. It was a powerful engine of prosperity and a fragile one, though no one riding out to the water in the summer of 1876 had any reason to think so. The peak had no single author. A resort that pulls 1 million people in a single weekend is built by thousands of hands. Railroad men, hotel keepers, small operators renting rooms by the week. But a few names stand out because they built the thing the peninsula would be remembered for, the amusements. The first was George Tillieu, who had already turned Coney Island's Steeplechase Park into one of the most famous pleasure grounds in the country. In 1900, he bought land in the seaside section of the Rockaways and carried his brand of mechanized fun out to the beach, wagering that the crowds packing Coney's rides would pay to ride them here as well. Close behind came Lamarcus Adna Thompson, who held some of the earliest American roller coaster patents and, more than almost anyone, invented the machine that would define a century of amusement. Around 1901 and 1902, the district that would come to be known as Rockaways Playland took shape along the sand, a permanent midway of coasters and rides fixed in place to catch the summer trade. Under A. Joseph Geist, who took it over in 1928, Playland grew into the anchor of the whole peninsula, the thing a family rode the train an hour to reach. These were the men who built the Rockaways up. The man who would preside over their coming apart was not, in those years, paying the peninsula much attention. Robert Moses, the park's commissioner and highway builder who, for more than 3 decades, shaped the physical form of New York more completely than any elected official, would in time turn to the Rockaways the way he turned to every shoreline in the region. But it is worth being careful here. When the reversal came, Moses was its most visible hand, not its only one. What remade the peninsula was a whole machinery of the post-war city, slum clearance law, federal money, and a welfare bureaucracy with its own quiet logic about where certain people ought to be sent. Moses worked that machinery with more force and less hesitation than anyone alive. He did not invent it. That distinction will matter. By the middle of the 20th century, the machine the railroad had built was running at capacity, and its scale is easiest to grasp through three things a visitor would have seen from the train window. The first was the housing, and the housing turned out to be the key to everything. Behind the dunes stood block after block of bungalows, small, single-story wooden cottages built for one purpose: to be lived in through a summer and shut up for the winter. Cheaper still were the bungalow colonies and the tent grounds. Rows of canvas and clapboard, where families who could not afford a hotel rented a room or a plot for the season. This was what made the Rockaways democratic in a way few American resorts ever were. The sand out front cost nothing, and the roof behind it could be had for a working family's wages. It was also, though no one described it this way at the time, a peninsula whose housing had been engineered from the beginning to be cheap and temporary. Thrown up fast, built light, meant to stand empty half the year. The second thing was the boardwalk. It ran 5 miles along the ocean, a wooden spine laid down the length of the beach, and it was the stage on which the whole summer performance took place. In 1939, the WPA Guide to New York described a peninsula of about 45,000 year-round residents that had almost no industry of its own, except the business of serving the crowds who arrived each summer to walk it. That single detail carried the whole logic of the place. Strip away the visitors, and there was very little underneath. The third was Playland. Fixed in the sand near Beach 98th Street, Rockaways Playland was the anchor the entire peninsula turned on. The reason a family would ride an hour out from the city and back. Its wooden roller coaster, the Atom Smasher, was filmed in 1952 for This Is Cinerama, one of the first widescreen motion pictures, so that audiences across the country could ride the Rockaways without leaving their seats. In its prime, the park drew visitors by the tens of millions across the decades, its lights strung out along the water where the train let the crowds off almost at the gate. Three things, then, planted along the same bar of sand: cheap seasonal housing, a 5-mile boardwalk, and an amusement park at Beach 98th Street. Each of them was, in that moment, a mark of how far the Rockaways had come. Each of them would come to mean something very different. Picture the peninsula in full season, at the height of it all. By the 1930s and 1940s, a summer weekend followed a script the whole place knew by heart. The trains came in one after another across the trestle over Jamaica Bay and set their crowds down almost at the sand. The 5-mile boardwalk filled end to end. Behind it, the bungalow blocks and the tent colonies were rented to capacity, families stacked into rooms built for exactly this and nothing else. Out near Beach 98th Street, Playland ran its coasters along the water, the Atom Smasher's wooden frame rising above the midway. For those hours, the Rockaways were one of the densest gatherings of people anywhere in the city. Working New York, Irish and Jewish and every other kind, all of it emptied out of the boroughs and poured onto a bar of sand. And then, every autumn, it drained. This is the part of the tableau that matters most because it was not a sign of trouble. It was how the machine was built to run. When the season ended, the trains thinned. The concessions along the boardwalk shut their fronts, and street after street of bungalows was boarded up and left dark. The summer city of hundreds of thousands fell back to the modest number who lived there all year. Every September, the peninsula let go of almost all of its people, and every May, it drew the crowd back in. For a resort, this was health. The whole apparatus, the light construction, the rooms rented by the season, the dependence on a single summer trade, was perfectly suited to a place that filled and emptied on schedule. What no one had reason to weigh in a good year was the question folded inside that rhythm: what a place like this becomes when the crowd stops coming back, and the empty half of the year turns into the whole of it. Strip the summer away and look at what the Rockaways actually were underneath the crowd. They were first, a standing supply of the cheapest housing in New York. The bungalows and the colonies had been built to the lowest standard the market would bear. Light frames, thin walls, no provision for winter, because they only ever had to survive a season. Read one way, that was the bargain that democratized the beach. Read another way, it made the peninsula a place already covered in housing that cost almost nothing and asked almost nothing of whoever filled it. They were, second, a place without a permanent public. A neighborhood that empties every autumn does not accumulate the things that let a neighborhood defend itself: the year-round shops, the settled institutions, the voters who turn out because they will still be there in the spring. The Rockaways had crowds, but for much of the year they had almost no constituency. And a place with no one to speak for it is a place where the decisions get made from somewhere else. They were, third, far away. The isolation that had once been the resort's entire appeal, a world set apart, an hour from the city and out of its reach, was, seen from the city's side, simply distance. It put the peninsula out of sight of the neighborhoods that might have objected to what came next. Cheap housing, already standing, no settled public to resist. Land at the far edge, where few would look. These were the three facts that had made the Rockaways a great resort. They were, without a single one of them changing, the same three facts that would make it useful for something else entirely. All that had to happen was for the crowd to stop coming, and for a city to look at what was left and see an opportunity. The break, when it came, arrived first as fire. In 1950, a blaze tore through the timber trestle that carried the railroad across Jamaica Bay. The same long wooden span that had opened the peninsula to the city nearly 80 years earlier. The Long Island Railroad, deep in financial trouble, had little appetite for rebuilding it. So the city stepped in, bought the line that ran out to the beach, and rebuilt it as part of the subway. The reworked route reopened to riders on June 28, 1956. The inland stretch that had once run north through the heart of Queens was not so lucky. It was left to fall quiet, its rails vanishing under brush. A ghost line through the borough, argued over to this day. But the fire was only the visible edge of the break. The deeper shift was in the crowd itself. In the years after the war, the automobile and cheap air travel put the whole coastline within reach of ordinary families, and then put Florida within reach after that. A bar of sand off the edge of Queens had never been special because of the sand. It had been special because it was the easy escape, the one an hour's train ride could deliver. Once every shore was an easy escape. That advantage was gone. The very conversion of the line said as much. The railroad that had carried excursion crowds to a resort was now just another subway, a local line running out to what was becoming an ordinary place. The summer trade thinned, and then it collapsed, and there was nothing underneath it. A peninsula, with almost no industry but the business of serving visitors, does not have a second economy to fall back on. When the visitors stopped, the jobs, the shops, and the tax money left with them. This was the trigger, and it is important not to mistake it for the whole story. Resorts up and down the country were emptying for exactly these reasons, in exactly these years, and most of them simply grew quiet. What happened next on the Rockaways was different, and it did not happen on its own. The emptied peninsula, cheap housing already standing, no settled public to object, land far out at the edge, was about to be looked at by a city that had a use for precisely such a place. The city that looked at the emptied peninsula was not looking for a resort to save. It was looking for room. New York in the post-war years had a housing problem it was solving by demolition. Across the boroughs, whole neighborhoods were being cleared under the banner of slum clearance and renewal. And every block that came down produced families who had to go somewhere. Where they went was a decision, and the decisions were not made by the people being moved. The Rockaways offered an answer that was almost too convenient. Here was a strip of land already carpeted in the cheapest housing in the city. Bungalows and colonies that had rented for a summer's wage precisely because they were built light and left empty half the year. Once the crowd stopped coming, that same construction became something new. Not seasonal rooms for vacationers, but year-round shelter, at the bottom of the market, for people the city needed to put somewhere. What had been the cheapest way to spend a July was now the cheapest place to be housed in December. And the peninsula's oldest quality, its distance, had quietly changed meaning again. In the resort era, being an hour out at the edge of the city was the whole appeal. In the relocation era, it was a different kind of asset. Histories of the peninsula's decline describe a welfare bureaucracy that steered relocated families toward the Rockaways, in part because the isolation was no longer counted as a drawback. Many of those being placed there were not expected to find work, so their distance from the city's jobs was treated as beside the point. The logic was rarely stated so plainly, but it ran underneath the placements all the same. A sorting that used the edge of the map to hold the people the center had cleared away. Then came the towers. Where the bungalows had housed the relocated poor by default, the city began to house them by design. Public housing rose on the peninsula in a tight, deliberate cluster. Arverne houses opened in 1951, Hamels houses in 1955, Redfern houses in 1959, and in 1961 the 1,400-apartment Edgemere houses. Project after project, most of them concentrated toward the eastern, poorer end of the Sand. In a single decade, a former resort acquired one of the densest concentrations of public housing anywhere in the borough. This was the phase in which Robert Moses becomes visible. Around 1956, as the Parks Commissioner and Slum Clearance Czar turned his attention to the peninsula, accounts of the period describe a plan to raze thousands of the old seaside structures between Beach 90th and Beach 74th Streets and replace them with dozens of high-rise buildings. The bungalow, the thing that had made the beach democratic, was now an obstacle to be cleared, and the tower was the instrument that would hold, in stacked and permanent form, the population the peninsula had been chosen to receive. There is a name for what these programs meant to the families inside them. The writer James Baldwin, describing the clearance drives of these years across the country, called urban renewal by its truer name, Negro removal. What was sold as improvement was, again and again, the relocation of black and poor households out of land the city wanted and into land the city did not. And on the Rockaways, the land the city did not want was the far end of a barrier beach. It is worth being exact about blame. Moses drove this harder than any other figure, but he did not invent the machine, and he could not have run it alone. It took federal renewal dollars, a body of clearance law, a housing authority, and a welfare bureaucracy with its own logic about where people belonged. And underneath all of it, the plain physical fact that the peninsula was already covered in cheap housing with almost no one to speak for it. Moses pulled the levers. The levers were already there. Once the towers were up, the money that had built them went away. The ambition, on paper, had been enormous. In 1965, the Eastern District of Arverne was formally designated an urban renewal area, and the bulldozers did their work. Through the late 1960s, block after block of the old resort was cleared to bare ground to make way for a modern community that planners promised would rise in its place. Thousands of new units, a whole neighborhood remade. Then, the promise simply stopped. New York slid toward the fiscal crisis of the mid-1970s. The city ran out of money and will, and the grand replacement never came. What renewal left behind was not renewal. It was demolition without the second half. So the peninsula entered its longest phase, and it was not a dramatic one. There was no single closure to mark, no factory gate chained shut. There was only subtraction, carried out slowly and quietly over decades. The cleared land in Arverne, some 300 acres of it, sat behind fences and grew weeds. Fallow for close to 40 years, one of the largest tracts of empty ground in the entire city. Around it, the projects filled, and the bungalows that survived aged into slums. The stores that had lived off the summer trade thinned out. The tax base, tied to that same vanished trade, thinned with them. Year after year, the Rockaways had a little less of everything a functioning place is made of, and a little more of the one thing they had been chosen to hold. The arithmetic of that decline does not read like the arithmetic of an ordinary town losing its people. And this is the detail that unlocks the whole story. In the simplest sense, the peninsula was not emptying out at all. Its year-round population held, and in later decades it even grew. What was concentrating on this bar of sand was not people. It was poverty. Counted in housing, and the pattern is stark. By 1975, the Rockaways held about 5% of the population of Queens and 57% of its low-income housing. Count it in dependence, and it is starker still. By 1990, roughly a third of the peninsula was living on public assistance, and nearly a quarter of its households reported incomes under $10,000 a year. Count it in land, and you arrive at the strangest figure of all. An emptied resort that had become at once among the least densely settled ground in New York City and among its very poorest. Here is the whole story, said plainly. The Rockaways did not die when the tourists left. They were repurposed. The very things that had made this a great resort. Cheap housing built to be temporary. A population that vanished every autumn and left almost no one to speak for the place. And open land at the city's furthest edge were the same things that made it the place New York chose to store the people it would not house anywhere else. The beach was never the problem, and the beach never left. What left was the resort. What replaced it was a warehouse. Follow each of the things planted at the peak, and you can read the whole reversal in what became of them. Start with the railroad, the line that had broken the old arithmetic of distance and let the whole city onto the sand. After the trestle fire, it was cut in two, and the two halves went to opposite fates. The southern portion, out on the peninsula, was rebuilt and folded into the subway. It still runs today, carrying riders past the beach it was made for. The inland portion, the 3.5 miles that ran north through central Queens toward Rego Park, was simply abandoned. Trains stopped crossing it in 1962, and in the 60-odd years since, a forest has grown up through the tracks. An elevated ruin of embankments and rusting rails, hidden behind the back fences of Queens. Today it is fought over. One camp wants to make it a park in the manner of Manhattan's High Line, under the name Queens Way. Another wants the trains back. The line that once carried 1 million people a weekend now carries an argument about what to do with its corpse. Then the bungalows. The cheap, light, seasonal housing that had made the beach democratic. Their disposability, built in from the start, became their destiny. Most were cleared in the renewal years or left to rot into the slums the towers were meant to replace. And only a scattered remnant of the old colonies still stands, valued now as relics of the resort that made them. What the wrecking crews missed, the ocean eventually reached. When the surge came, the structures that stood lowest and lightest on the sand were the ones with the least between them and the water. And the boardwalk, the 5-mile wooden spine, down which the whole summer performance had once moved. On October 29, 2012, Hurricane Sandy tore apart nearly 3.5 of its 5 miles. When the city rebuilt it, it did not rebuild in wood. The new boardwalk is concrete, set on a reinforced spine and engineered to stand against the next storm. A promenade built less for pleasure now than for defense. 3 anchors of the peak, 3 endings, a ruin argued over, a housing type the water came for, and a wooden walk remade in concrete against the sea. Tally the peninsula as it stands now, and the ledger reads in 2 columns that do not resolve into a single number. Start with the people. By 2012, the Rockaways had climbed to a record of roughly 128,400 residents. The population had grown fast through the 2000s, faster than the city as a whole. Then Sandy struck, and within 2 years, the count fell by about 16%, a loss of some 20,000 people, before recovering to around 127,400 by 2016. The income figures are the ones that carry the older story forward. As late as a 2018 State Comptroller's report, the Rockaways had the second lowest median household income of any neighborhood in Queens, and the poverty stayed where it had been placed. The eastern communities, Edgemere, Far Rockaway, Hamels, still recorded the lowest incomes and the highest rates of hardship on the peninsula. Then the storm's own ledger, which fell along the lines the century had drawn. When Sandy came ashore on October 29, 2012, the structures that suffered worst were the ones sitting lowest and lightest on the sand, and the residents left waiting longest were often the poorest. In the public housing at Redfern, people were trapped without power for days. Across the peninsula, some households and businesses went without full service for as long as 7 months. There is a bitter symmetry in it. The high-rise towers that had been imposed on the peninsula as a blight turned out, in the flood, to be the safer place to be, while the low houses closer to the ground took the water. At the far western tip, in the affluent, largely Irish co-op of Breezy Point, a place apart from the public housing east, a wind-driven electrical fire destroyed about 126 homes in a single night, the largest private residential fire in the fire department's history. And then the other column, the one that has been filling more recently. On the cleared land that sat fallow for 40 years, a planned community called Arverney by the Sea began taking in residents in 2006. Roughly 2,300 homes on ground, the developers raised some 8 feet against the sea. A ferry to Manhattan, relaunched in 2017, began carrying around 2,000 riders a day at the summer peak, and beach visitors climbed from about 1 million to 3 million over 4 years. That same year, the city rezoned downtown Far Rockaway for up to 3,100 new apartments. Surfers now ride the same water the excursion trains once ran toward. The peninsula, in other words, is being reinvented again, unevenly and on raised ground. What it is not being turned back into is what it started as. At Beach 98th Street, the train still stops. It is an elevated station on the line that runs out along the peninsula, the same right-of-way, rebuilt, that the railroad first laid down to carry the excursion crowds to the sea. The trains come through on a concrete viaduct above the street, the ocean a block to the south. The platform is usually close to empty. In 2024, the station recorded 99,133 riders for the entire year, which placed it 491st out of the 423 stations in the New York City subway, near the very bottom of the system. The station has a name. It was given that name on May 15, 1933, and it has kept it ever since. The sign on the platform reads, Beach 98th Street Playland. The park it points to is gone. Rockaways Playland ran its last season in 1985 and was taken down soon after. Housing stands on the ground where the Atom Smasher once rose. Nothing of the amusement park remains. Not a ride, not a ticket booth, not a length of track. The one thing left of it is the word on that sign, a name the station still reads out to the few people who get off there, half a block from the water where a million once came. The trains keep the schedule. The sign keeps the name. The beach is still there.